So the historical critical approach. This is kind of the foundation stone of much of academic biblical studies as people that go through the academic mill, as I have, um, are introduced to this particular approach. It is an approach that attempts to be rooted in history. That is, the text means something within history. And the idea of being critical means that we're asking questions about the text. Can it really mean X or can it really mean Y? Of course, right now, I sit here getting ready to go to a conference put on by the Association of Theological Schools, in which we're going to be talking about theological education. And this is June 18 of 2018, and one of the things that I'm very well aware of, given a public debate by the U.S. Attorney General and Press Secretary over the last 7 days, I'm very aware of why the Bible still is important, and interpreting it and looking at it broadly, trying to consider all of the questions, is so important. So historical critical approach is interested in things like authorship. So in the book of Luke and Acts, we have traditionally attributed authorship to Luke, the great physician. He's mentioned in a number of New Testament books. For example, Philemon 24, Colossians 4:14. He is an associate of Paul. Now, some date this work or these works to as late as the early 2nd century, but I am not convinced by those articles. I think, or by those points of view. I think the idea that Luke is up close and personal with some of the events, I think that is a convincing argument. I think the argument that on the reverse side, though, I think some of the argument that Luke and Acts shows a particular interest or expertise by a physician, I think that may be a case of us wanting to find what we want to be true, as Luke is talked about as a physician. So I'm not as convinced by that argument. I'm convinced that the writer is pretty educated. The Greek in Luke and Acts is much more difficult Greek than the Greek, for example, in Mark or in John's Gospel and letters. That makes me think that this writer had some kind of education. The more educated, typically, it's not always the case, I guess, but the more educated somebody is, the more, some would say, convoluted. I don't think that's the case necessarily with Luke, but the more precise the language is, and the greater the vocabulary is. So, and those two things are true of Luke and Acts. Now, as far as the date, I tend to opt for an earlier date on this book, not a later date. One of the reasons for it is because Luke, who seems to be very committed, if you read the first few verses of Luke and the first few verses of the book of Acts, you find he seems to be very committed to rendering an historical or an historically accurate picture of what happened, what went on. And there's no mention of the destruction of the temple or the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE or AD. They're the same thing, Common Era or Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. There's no mention of that in Luke or Acts. I tend to think that if such an important event had happened before Luke wrote this gospel or the book of Acts, for sure, pardon me, then it would have come up. It would have been mentioned. Also, we are left kind of hanging that Paul, one of the main characters in the book of Acts, along with Simon Peter, pardon me, Paul is still alive at the end. Luke is not hesitant to record the deaths of some of the apostles or other early witnesses to Jesus. Why wouldn't he do that with Paul if Paul had died during the writing of this book? And it seems that Paul was martyred somewhere between 64 and 66 CE. So that tends to tell me that this book was probably an early 60s production by the writer. Now, one of the other things, and you're wondering, why is this important? Because throughout the course of the course, I'm going to say things that just kind of automatically reference some of this historical material or some of the literary material. It's good to have a record of it, and you can have it in your mind. Look, I need to go back and look at that Ragsdale video from week 2 because he said something over here in week 7 that I'm struggling with. What's he doing? What's he saying? How'd that happen? So I'm just trying to lay out some groundwork that I think can be helpful for you. Now, one of the things that I am particularly interested in is the literary understanding of the scripture. History is important. Historical studies are important. I do that kind of thing all the time. At the same time, the primary, I guess, interest that I have in the text is really much more of a literary interest. What does the text mean as literature? So one of the questions that I end up thinking about with respect to New Testament books, Old Testament books too, is this issue of genre. That is, what kind, genre equals kind or ilk, type, what kind of literature is this? In biblical studies, the word genre can be used to refer to legal material or hymns or poetry or prose. Those are, big categories. Epistles, gospels, all of that kind of thing. And then subgenres underneath that. So is Luke's gospel, is it history or is it literature? And part of the decision that we make is resulting from diagnosing, right? We're taking in information and we are saying, this needs a diagnosis, this needs a definition, exactly what a gospel is. Is it a biography? Well, biographies, while they do have a point and they are trying to make a point about someone, Luke's gospel seems to be more than biography. It's theology as well. Luke is trying to tell us something about God, and certainly with that, something about Jesus as the Son of God. And so when I try to think about what this genre of a gospel is, I'm asking questions about how these writers use historical events. And that, kind of leads me down that line of getting, in my mind, getting it straight what a gospel is. It's not just something we hear read on Sunday morning, a few verses. It's something bigger than that. And I would say, when you go over to 1 Corinthians 15, which is one of the books that St. Paul wrote, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. And you see this in Peter's letters as well. I was reading 1 Peter just yesterday. The idea that Jesus rose from the dead is fundamentally important for what a gospel is. So is there historical information, biographical information about Jesus? Yes, there is. But it culminates not in the death, but in the, two-sided coin of Jesus' death and resurrection. That's ultimately of incredible importance for defining what a gospel is. Okay, more in a minute.